Yes, nice. It's nice. Yeah, great.
Cool, right. Everyone can hear me? Anyone with audio impairments, can you hear me? No. Okay, so yeah, I'm Mark. I work at Sony as a user researcher, so day in, day out, I'm doing UX with our first-party teams, helping to make the games more user-friendly before they're launched. But I also have a very long background in accessibility as well, so I've been doing accessibility for about as long as I've been doing UX, which is about 7 years now, which is a scary number. So what I'm going to do today is talk about how to make games a bit more accessible. Cool. So according to the World Health Organization, roughly 1 in 7 people have some form of disability. It can be something that they're born with or something that kind of develops much later in life. It can be something that affects any one of us at any point. It typically stems from having some kind of medical condition, but most importantly, medical conditions aren't disabilities, and that's an important fact to kind of get across before we kind of get into the main meat of what I'm going to be talking about today. So, I did promise us a Gandalf slide. So basically, disability occurs when someone with a medical condition comes across a barrier that they can't progress past. So this could be someone who uses a wheelchair day to day, who can't get into a building because there's no step-free access. It could be my mum in a coffee shop not being able to read the specials because they've used white and yellow. It can be any number of things that kind of makes any one of us a disabled person in a disabling environment. And the most frustrating thing about that is typically these barriers are put there by someone else. It's more or less someone has designed something in a way that ends up making someone else disabled, which is quite a frustrating fact to kind of get your head around. But thankfully, there's accessibility, which is all about making sure that these either disabling situations, they don't occur in the first place, or that there are kind of ways to kind of get around, design around it, basically. So if you think about trying to design for all of the hundreds of thousands of medical conditions that there are, it's very overwhelming, and you're going to take a lot of your brain power to try and work out which ones you can do and which ones you can't do. But basically what you can do is you can group these conditions, these impairments, into basically 5 groups, and within that kind of put them together into 3 categories. So the first category is issues with receiving a stimulus, and this is to do with visual and auditory impairments, so anything to do with so color blindness, low vision, even legal blindness would come under the vision, and low hearing, deafness, even stuff like tinnitus you could count in terms of the auditory impairments. Next is issues with processing and determining a response. This is all kind of cognitive stuff. So a few things kind of Lucy touched on previously. So anything such as like dyslexia, dyspraxia, learning impairments, any number of things like that can come under this kind of umbrella of the cognitive disabilities, or cognitive impairments rather. And then the final grouping is issues with providing an input. So this is all stuff to do with motor and speech. So obviously with games, it's very unique in terms of other forms of entertainment. So these are all about kind of providing the player, or the player providing the game with their input. So if you want to photograph something, this is a very good slide. But yeah, basically this is the, this is a really good takeaway if there is one for this session. It's also at the end, so if you miss it now. Awesome. Cool. So basically, the gaming sector, it's a little further behind in terms of accessibility compared to a lot of other entertainment and technology. So you have stuff like subtitles in film. You have it on Netflix at BBC. It's got some very, very good subtitling guidelines. You have audio narration and audio description in terms of TV. Also, many cinemas are offering screenings now with audio descriptions. You have a plethora of accessibility options in your phone, on computers, voice commands with Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant, all that kind of stuff. I mean, Apple is one of the forefront leading runners in this kind of stuff, and a lot of kind of disabled or people with lots of impairments tend to flock to kind of Apple devices because they kind of can provide a lot of this accessibility. You've got stuff like JAWS, screen readers for Windows, for blind users. And there's even a big movement to make board games accessible, particularly blind accessible. So that's some blind accessible Scrabble that you can see there. Obviously, games are starting to catch up now. We've got a lot of system-side stuff from both Microsoft and from Sony in terms of stuff that you can turn on the system, such as large text, narration, custom button assignments. All that stuff is baked into the consoles now. And a lot of games are starting to add it in. So even Uncharted 4, it's kind of one of the big names from last year, had a top-level home screen accessibility heading. You could go in and kind of do a whole bunch of stuff that made it a lot more open and accessible for people with many different impairments. So video games are a very, very great medium. They act as a form of escapism, and it's obviously very, very important for people who can't do certain things in the real world for them to often want to do this in the kind of the worlds of video games. There's a great video on the Special Effect website of a guy who wants to play GTA not because he wants to go around murdering people, but because he wants to just walk around a city, something he can't do in real life. It's very moving, good video. But this form of escapism is what makes people want to play video games, and something that by having those barriers there means that we're not allowing people who want to play the games, who have these impairments, to be able to do. They also act, video games, as a way to communicate with your friends, to play with your friends who might be in different countries, to play especially on a level playing field where a person's impairment won't be a factor to them. So people with all kinds of impairments can play and feel as skilled and as powerful as people who don't have impairments. There's even great videos of people who are quadriplegic amputees who are just killing it at WoW. And on top of that, people want to play the video games that are being talked about. People want to play what is big in the media right now. It's a great photo of me with Conan O'Brien there. But if they can't play these video games, then it's exclusionary. People get frustrated and upset. They can't play the same games their friends are playing and can't play the same games that are being talked about on all the websites they read and all the kind of, if they see stuff on Twitter or anything like that. A big one from last year was Pokemon Go. A lot of people with physical limitations who were wheelchair-bound were struggling to play the game because they couldn't get around and catch the Pokemon that their friends were catching. They could drop the lures, but they only attracted like Pidgeys and all the time. And as someone who caught a lot of Pidgeys and Rattatas, it's rubbish. So basically, there was getting a lot of frustration around that. And obviously, it's a very big part of people's lives. I mean, I'm guessing pretty much everyone here today plays games in some capacity. It's such a great medium, and it shouldn't be something that we kind of exclude other people from playing just because of the way it's been designed. So game accessibility is not about fundamentally changing the design of a game. It's a very important thing to get across. It's also not about making the game as easy as possible. Even people with impairments want to have some form of challenging their games. What it is about is kind of taking into account the different types of impairments, or the 5 kind of categories that I showed you earlier, and basically thinking of ways to either design kind of agnostically and design with kind of all these things in mind so it doesn't affect the players as they're playing, or to offer kind of different options and assist for players to kind of toggle on and off at their leisure to be able to, again, play the game. One thing, games are obviously fundamentally, they need some kind of necessary barriers to what make them a game. So platforming games are always going to require you to have some degree of precision and timing to make those jumps. What is important with game accessibility is not having unnecessary barriers. So QuickTime events are obviously a big offender of this for many games. I remember playing Resident Evil 4 the first time and getting crushed by a boulder because I wasn't expecting it. So being able to kind of either turn off these kind of secondary mechanics that are put into games, or being able to kind of offer players a different way to interact with them. So instead of rapidly bashing a button, just being able to hold it down instead allows and opens up the game to a much wider audience. So it's about thinking about what is a necessary barrier for that game. Obviously, it changes from genre to genre. I mean, L.A. Noire was a great example. It offered players the option to skip combat if they died and just get back to investigating, which is obviously the core mechanic of that game. So, like I said, the way to kind of really get accessibility into the game is either think about different ways that you can kind of message. So, for example, not denoting stuff by color alone, or by offering different options that people can toggle on and off within the game. So I've got 2 examples I'm going to run through, and hopefully not overrun on time. So like I say, the first one is communicating information in multiple ways. And the example I'm going to use is different ways that you can use color in video games and how you can make it accessible. So really, you can put any color in a game to denote anything. It's frequently used as a visual shorthand. The number of times you see green for good guys and red for bad guys, but obviously doesn't take into account people who are red-green colorblind. No one really sees, or do we know? Does everyone know that we see color the same way as everyone else? It's a tricky one, but we have to kind of get around this, only using it as a visual shorthand and not kind of providing any other additional information for players. So this is a good number of spectrums there that you can see. It's also a good way to test if you're colorblind today. Statistically speaking, about 8 of you should be. So as you can see at the top, that is what, I don't like normal vision, I prefer no color blindness, but basically what the traditional spectrum would look like if you don't have any form of color blindness. The sorry, I can't say that. Basically the green color blindness underneath that. Protanopia and protanomaly, it's red color blindness, and tritanopia, tritanomaly, blue color blindness. And basically the difference is the nopias are where you don't have that colored rod in your eye, picking up the color, and the anomalous ones are ones where you have it, but it's functioning slightly differently. So really those are the kind of the 7 big ones that you'll see there. And as you can see, if you choose red and green to mean good and bad in your game, obviously there's going to be a percentage of people who don't see it as that. They'll probably end up seeing it as shades of yellow or slightly different shades of green. So one way around this that you can provide players is with different colorblind options. And we're seeing this a lot more in games. And it's a really, really great way to kind of get around this. So for example, here in Killzone Shadowfall, you've got your friendlies are green, anyone who's in your player party is blue, and anyone who's an enemy is red. And you'll remember from the previous slide, that's green, red, and blue. So a few issues maybe with that. However, with the addition of 3 colorblind modes there, it changes the color palette and allows players to change the appearance of the color to whatever best suits them. And this isn't necessarily something that only colorblind players will use, but anyone who may be struggling with the contrast. I mean, even that green and the blue to me looks quite close, so it's something that you can change and basically adapt for yourself and play without that barrier. Hue is a fantastic indie puzzle platform. I highly recommend it. It's a game all about color. And you basically have to change the colors that you're kind of given as you pick up the game, and use the color changing to basically knock out colors in the game. So here you change to orange, and that would take away the orange wall. Obviously, you think someone with color blindness just can't play that, but the developers thought about this ahead of time, and this is where accessibility is really easy to do if you think about it at the start. And by thinking about it at the start and realizing we're going to knock out a percentage of our players if we make it colorblind unfriendly, what they did was they added in unique symbols for each color and allows players who may not be seeing the colors to be able to pick it out as easily to work out which color they need to swap to at any time. And in fact, I even prefer playing with the symbols on because I just think it looks better. So by thinking about it at the start, they're able to design with color blindness in mind and provide this option way ahead of time rather than trying to retrofit it in at the end. So a few tips if there's any kind of designing with color in mind and kind of providing this information in multiple ways. So just make sure there's no kind of information conveyed by color alone. You can always add additional meaning with symbol shapes, patterns, size, screen position, text descriptions. There's a whole bunch of things you can do to kind of double up on what you're trying to say with the color. Providing those preset options for the 3 main types of color blindness is always a good start. However, it's not always the be-all and end-all because obviously it doesn't work for all players and people may need to swap in and out of different colors. And even there are people who are colorblind who don't even know which one of those they fit into. I know a former colleague of mine was red-green colorblind, and going through the Killzone Shadowfall example, he had to put the deuteranopia on, but he didn't realize that was the type of colorblindness he was. So yeah, even having examples and stuff helps players work out which one they need to turn on. And to go one further would be offering a completely configurable choice of colors so players can kind of basically say, I want this element to be this color and kind of decide what works best for them, but within the framework of the game. Cool. Next up, I'm going to talk a quick about offering the flexibility, so the other side to designing accessibly. And with this, I'm going to highlight it with an example for controls, which is obviously the thing that makes games so unique from everything other kinds of medium, and obviously throws up a whole bunch of accessibility issues because obviously players in Control, it's not a passive experience. It's not as easy as kind of turning on subtitles or audio descriptions or something like that. Players are actually giving feedback and commands to the game. And they do this obviously through a plethora of different ways. There's loads of different video game controllers, and they've evolved massively over time, as you can see. So basically, how do you design with this in mind? How do you offer that flexibility in terms of player control? One that EA actually stumbled across by accident was the two-button control in FIFA, and this has been since the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and it's been in every single game since then, I believe. Basically, they added this mode to make it more beginner-friendly, so anyone could pick up and play, along with any seasoned FIFA player. What this actually does is it makes it a whole lot easier for players with motor impairments to kind of get into the game because they don't have to worry about complicated inputs in the game. They're limited to sprint, shooting and passing. They can sprint if they like and then moving the character. So by oiling the game down to its simplest controls, it kind of opened it up and allowed a lot of people who thought they couldn't play the game because they thought they had to use a lot of different commands and controls to play with their friends, actually the option to play alongside them. Offering multiple default button layouts is also a good way of kind of offering that flexibility as well. So obviously stuff like Halo and Call of Duty, they have a lot of these in by default now. The best way to think about these is designing with, again, thinking about different button inputs. So are you kind of asking the player to do particular combos? Do those buttons need to be closer together rather than further apart for certain players who maybe can only play with one hand, have limited reach, or can't press and hold different buttons at the same time? Equally, if you're a left-handed player or southpaw, then a lot of the options you might find in here might help you because a lot of the time southpaw is now kind of a standard option in there. So even something as simple as being left-handed, something with like this definitely helps out. So not everything is kind of what you think is a disability. You have completely configurable controls. So I was demoing a bit of this earlier on the PS4 itself. But games like Drive Club allow you to swap every single command to every other button in the game. And by playing around, you can actually end up controlling this game just with one hand if you feel like it, because you can swap the accelerate and brake and make sure they're on the same side on, say, R1 and R2. And they can even have the steering on the gyro if you so wish. But basically, you can move every button around and make it so that it's custom for your playstyle or custom to your impairment. And again, this doesn't benefit just players with any kind of form of motor impairment, but anyone who just feels they want to swap buttons around. I remember playing Super Smash Brothers a few years ago now, and I just couldn't get my head around the fact that jump was on X and not on B. And so swapping it made the game completely playable to myself. And then there are games that kind of offer multiple ways to interact with a game. So you can see Until Dawn there, originally designed for the PS3 as a PS Move game. So obviously motion controls were baked into the kind of the history of the game. But as the game development progressed and it moved on to PS4, it was opened up to include traditional stick controls as well. So obviously, not only does that give any able-bodied player the option to switch to something they feel more comfortable with, but anyone who had trouble moving the motion controls could also use stick controls, and even to the point where you can just have the controller on the table and just use the sticks to interact. You don't have to do any kind of motion of turning, particularly to make any choices, because obviously some players have difficulty with that. So when designing with controls in mind and thinking about offering that flexibility, one way is to make sure it's not overcomplicated, or by kind of offering a simplified control scheme like with FIFA. Providing multiple presets like Call of Duty and Halo, like I showed, can offer a great deal of flexibility. Allowing for full control remapping offers also flexibility. Considering alternate input methods, so again, back to Until Dawn, motion controls and also stick controls help with that. Then simple things which are often included in everyday games anyway, so being able to invert the X and Y axes, and the sensitivity of the X and Y axes as well being adjustable. Allow for hold inputs to be toggled, so particularly if there are any QuickTime events in the game. I know, for example, the very first interactions you pretty much have to do in Batman Arkham Origins and the 2013 Tomb Raider were QuickTime events, and if you couldn't mash that button hard enough, you couldn't play that game. So not a good start if you can't manage that. And then a very one that's often overlooked is being able to turn the rumble off, because obviously sometimes people have difficulty holding the controller, or difficulty getting that force feedback, and it can often interfere with kind of their muscles and stuff like that. So obviously allowing the rumble to be turned off definitely helps players as well. So there's a slide again if you want to take another picture. So as promised, that is the main groupings if you want to think about designing with accessibility in mind. It's not as complicated and as overbearing as you might have thought, as long as you think about basically the sensors you're kind of covered in terms of how you think you can make a game more accessible. So yeah, basically the message today is, where possible, design inclusively with the game. Like I say, it's not about gutting the game and making it as simple and as bland as possible. It's about working out how you can make the game as accessible to as many people as possible without necessarily compromising the original design decision for the game and kind of the vision of it. no point does any accessibility advocate say you should make a game that is, a 100% accessible and kind of forgets what the game is trying to be. It should be obviously a game first and foremost, but it should be as open to as many people as well, if possible. So yeah, like I say, it's about giving as many players the best opportunity of completely experiencing the game. No one wants to get halfway through a game and then realize that they can't finish it. It's a waste of money, it's a waste of time, they feel frustrated and angry. You don't read a book, get to a word you don't understand, and then stop reading the book because you can't progress. You just kind of keep moving on. But with games, these barriers exist and they can be really problematic for players. And as I've said multiple times during this presentation, it doesn't just benefit players who have impairments, who have these disabilities when they encounter barriers. It benefits everyone. Guaranteed there'll be some point in your lives where playing a game you feel like you need to change something in the game to make it much easier for yourself to play, regardless of any kind of disability or anything like that. And by having these options, it opens it up to anyone. And even new players to games, I mean, think how much the Wii opened up the market for people who weren't familiar or couldn't really use traditional controllers. Elderly gamers, obviously, we're all going to be old one day. We're all going to still want to be playing games. We don't want our arthritis to stop us from doing that. Even players simply who might have a broken arm and can't hold the controller the same way they used to. Stuff like this, it opens it up to anyone with any kind of impairment that may stop them from playing the game. Even just turning subtitles on because it's really noisy outside. That kind of stuff is kind of accessibility. So thank you.